Silent Sentinels, a pledge for women rights. Beginning in January 1917, a group of suffragists organized by Alice Paul and the National Women's Party became the first group to ever protest in front of the White House. These are historical clips that resulted in the constitutional amendment. In 1917, and the 69-year drive by women for the right to vote is climaxed by the appeal of the White House. In 1869, Susan B. Anthony became chairman of the executive committee of the National Women Suffrage Association. In Washington, in 1917, ticketing resulted in police action. President Wilson was considering the women's appeal. Their goal was to convince President Wilson to support publicly an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would guarantee a woman's right to vote. The protesters were called Silent Sentinels because they protested without speaking a word 6 days. Throughout a 2-year period, nearly 2,000 women protested, while hundreds were arrested, many were jailed, beaten, on hunger strikes, and horribly and unjustly treated by local and U.S. authorities. On February 24, 1919, 22 Massachusetts women were arrested and imprisoned in Boston Charles Street Jail for protesting during President Wilson's arrival at the Massachusetts State House. He was visiting Boston upon his return to the U.S. after a trip from the Paris Peace Conference, which formally ended World War I. A vocal leader of the 20th century women's suffrage movement, Alice Paul, advocated for and helped secure passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which granted women the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony quoted, "There shall never be another season of silence until women have the same rights men have on this green earth." In January 1917, Paul and over 1,000 Silent Sentinels began 18 months of picketing the White House, standing at the gates with signs such as, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" They endured verbal and physical attacks from spectators, which increased after the U.S. entered World War I. Instead of protecting the women's right to free speech and peaceful assembly, the police arrested them on the flimsy charge of obstructing traffic. Alice Paul was sentenced to jail for 7 months, where she organized a hunger strike in protest. Doctors threatened to send Paul to an insane asylum and force-fed her, while newspaper accounts of her treatment garnered public sympathy and support for the suffrage. On the Washington newspaper, Alice Paul, even though she was still in jail, demanded that she would be treated as a political prisoner. In the middle of one speech, Milholland declared, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" and immediately fainted, weeks later becoming the first American martyr for women's suffrage. Her triumphant death and appeal to America to finish the task she could not finish. The Silent Sentinels was organized by the National Women's Party, which was a women's suffrage organization. It was first founded as the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage in 1913 by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. The Suffragist was the National Women's Party weekly newsletter. It acted as a voice for the Silent Sentinels throughout their journey. It covered the Silent Sentinels' progress and included interviews with protesters, reports on President Wilson's reaction, and political essays. While the Sentinels were in prison, a few members, like Alice Paul, wrote about their experiences, which were later posted in The Suffragist. This image was from the Library of Congress. The Suffragist was intended for mass circulation. It peaked at over 20,000 issues in 1917. Most of the copies went to party members, advertisers, and NWP organizers who strongly suggest that the suffragists themselves were a key audience of the publication. The public's responses to the Silent Sentinels were varied. Some people approved of the work the Silent Sentinels were performing. Men and women would be present at the scene of the White House and showed their support for the Sentinels, while sometimes women would even assist in holding up the banners. Other ways of showing support included writing letters, praising the Sentinels to the suffragists, and donating money. On the other hand, some disapproved of the Silent Sentinels' protest. Anti-suffragists also opposed to the Silent Sentinels. Mobs sometimes attempted to deter the Silent Sentinels through violence. For example, some attacked the Silent Sentinels and tore their banners to shreds. At first, President Wilson was not very responsive to the women's protest. He even seemed amused by it, with tipping his hat and smiling. Moreover, he ignored the protest altogether, like when the Sentinels protested on the day of his second inauguration ceremony. As they continued to protest, the issue became bigger and Wilson's opinion began to change. Although he continued to dislike the Sentinels, he began to recognize them more seriously with presenting him with an issue. Women waited until May for Wilson to advocate formation of the House Committee on Women's Suffrage. This report resulted 3 years later in the 19th Amendment, the right for women to vote, where the Vice President Marshall signed. The first state ratification came from Illinois, where the governor put his amendment into effect. This is the most dramatic step to date of the women's campaign. On June 22, 1917, police arrested protesters Lucy Burns and Catherine Murray on charges of obstructing traffic because they carried a banner quoting from Wilson's speech to Congress. On June 25th, 12 women were arrested, including Mabel Vernon and Annie Arniel from Delaware, again on charges of obstructing traffic. They were sentenced to 3 days in jail or to pay a $10 fine. But they chose jail because they wanted to show commitment to their cause and their willingness to sacrifice their physical bodies. On July 14, 16 women were arrested and sentenced to 60 days in jail or to pay a $25 fine. Again, the women chose jail. Lucy Burns argued that the women should be treated as political prisoners, but that designation had never been used in America. While Alice Paul was in jail, she was placed in a solitary confinement for 2 weeks, with nothing to eat except bread and water. She became weak and unable to walk, so she was taken to the prison hospital. There, she began a hunger strike, and others joined her. On the night of November 14, 1917, known as the Night of Terror, the superintendent ordered the nearly 40 guards to brutalize the suffragists. These 40 prison guards went on a rampage against the 33 women suffragists charged with obstructing sidewalk traffic. And with this, they beat Lucy Burns, they chained her hands to the cell bars, and left her hanging for the night, breathing and gasping for some air. They hurled Dora Lewis into a dark cell, smashed her head against an iron bed, and knocked her out cold. Her cellmate thought Lewis was dead from a heart attack. For many weeks, the women's water came from an open pail. Their food was covered in slot and infested with worms. Newspaper carried stories about how the protesters were being treated. The stories angered some Americans and created more support for the suffrage amendment. On November 27 and 28, all protesters were released, including Alice Paul, who spent 5 weeks in prison. On January 9, 1918, Wilson announced his support for the women's suffrage amendment. The next day, the House of Representatives narrowly passed the amendment, but the Senate refused to even debate it until October. When the Senate voted on the amendment in October, it failed by 2 votes, and in spite of the ruling by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, arrest of White House protesters resumed on August 6, 1918. The National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, urged citizens to vote against anti-suffrage senators up for the election in the fall of 1918. By then, most members of the Congress were pro-suffrage. It was officially ratified on August 26, 1920. The Tennessee legislature ratified the 19th Amendment by the single vote.